Cuando la noche cae en la ciudad, las viejas leyendas cobran vida. Prepárate para escuchar las historias más terríficas.
It's 3 a.m. beneath the streets of Mexico City. Passenger service on Metro Line 2 has been shut down for hours. But down in the heavy shadow and cold mist near Viaducto station, maintenance workers report seeing something impossible. A glowing 1970s-era orange subway train glides silently out of the pitch-black darkness, moving at full speed before vanishing into the curved tunnel walls ahead. The visual of the train is striking, but it's the sound that gives track workers pause. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., the high-voltage electricity powering the third rail is completely severed to allow for safe track repairs. The tunnels should be completely dead, yet workers report feeling the heavy, distinct physical rumble of thousands of tons of steel approaching on unpowered tracks. And the rumble isn't the only sound echoing through the concrete. Track walkers performing manual inspections in the dead of night frequently report sudden, deafening noises tearing through the empty space, the violent screech of steel brakes, metal twisting, and muffled human screams. Then, just as abruptly as it starts, the noise cuts out, leaving absolute dead silence. It's not just the maintenance crews encountering these phenomena. Late-night commuters taking the final 11:30 p.m. train report stepping into sparsely populated cars, only to sit across from passengers who look wildly out of place. These figures are dressed in out-of-date 1970s attire, bell-bottoms, vintage coats, and dated hairstyles. They sit perfectly motionless, with pale, hollow expressions, staring straight ahead and ignoring all announcements. Before we figure out exactly who those passengers are, if you want to keep untangling the hidden histories beneath our modern cities, take a second to hit the like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. These independent reports follow highly specific, repeating patterns. When engineers and commuters describe identical vintage clothing and the same mechanical screams, they are describing the exact signatures of a single, localized trauma. To understand those echoes, we rewind to the morning of October 20, 1975. Up on the surface, Mexico City was a bustling, rapidly growing metropolis. Pedestrians were navigating their morning routines, and the city was waking up to a completely ordinary Monday. Down below, the Metro de la Ciudad de Mexico was operating at peak rush hour. The system was a vital artery for millions of commuters, and the conditions inside the stations were heavily overcrowded, a daily reality for a massive labor force trying to get to work on time. Train number 08, packed tightly with these morning commuters, was completely stationary at Viaducto station on Line 2. The doors were open, and even more passengers were squeezing into the orange cars to start their day. This top-down map shows Metro Line 2 and exactly what was happening simultaneously just one stop to the north. While Train 08 was boarding at Viaducto, Train number 10 was approaching rapidly from Chabacano station, hurtling down the track at 70 kilometers per hour. Central Control recognized the danger. They sent desperate manual warnings, and the tracks were equipped with automatic safety signaling designed to prevent this exact scenario. For reasons still debated, the driver of train number 10 failed to stop. The heavy, moving train slammed directly into the rear of the stationary train with immense force, crushing several passenger cars together into twisted metal. In a fraction of a second, an ordinary morning commute turned into the deadliest accident in the history of the Mexico City metro system. The official reports from the collision cite 31 lives lost and over 120 people injured. However, because of the extreme overcrowding during that peak morning rush hour, many local residents and rescue workers who pulled people from the wreckage suspected the actual human cost was significantly higher than the official count. When you align the facts of the crash with the stories told by modern track walkers, the hallucinations snap into sharp focus. The sudden screech of steel, the violent tearing of metal, and the muffled screams echoing through the tunnels near Viaducto station match the exact auditory profile of a multi-ton train collision. The visual connections are just as direct. The pale, motionless commuters wearing bell-bottoms and vintage coats, reported by late-night passengers, perfectly match the demographic of the victims who boarded Train 08 that morning in 1975. The sudden violence of the crash transformed a routine public space into a site of unresolved grief. By projecting the specific horrors of that morning onto the tunnels themselves, the community has effectively turned historical record into a living, subterranean memory. Looking at this station today, everything seems perfectly normal. Millions of people swipe their cards, board the orange trains, and ride Line 2 without ever thinking about the steel they are standing on. But places like Viaducto station operate as what sociologists call spectral memory sites. When a massive public trauma occurs, the facts eventually fade from the daily news cycle, but the emotional weight remains, mutating into permanent folklore to keep the memory alive. We often assume haunted places require ancient Aztec ruins, abandoned hospitals, or crumbling colonial mansions. Line 2 proves that deep, lasting cultural scars are easily embedded within bustling, concrete infrastructure built in the modern era. The people who understand this best are the ones who work the tunnels. For the night shift engineers, the legend is treated with quiet respect. Many of them carry small charms or rosaries, pausing to perform brief personal rituals before stepping onto the unpowered tracks between Chabacano and Viaducto after midnight. The phantom train functions as a permanent echo of an unforgotten tragedy. Beneath the daily commute and the heavy concrete slabs, the victims of 1975 remain on the rails, kept alive by the rituals of the workers and the stories of the city. If you stand in the heart of Mexico City at Plaza Rio de Janeiro, you'll find the Edificio Rio de Janeiro. It is known locally as La Casa de las Brujas, featuring a pointed black roof that resembles a witch's hat and brickwork that forms the distinct shape of a human face. Built in 1911 by engineer Regis de Castro, the Gothic structure was completed during the final months of the Porfiriato era, a time when Mexico City was undergoing a rapid, often jarring architectural transformation. While the facade is unsettling, the building's reputation for the supernatural is rooted in the events that took place inside its walls, specifically within the ground floor apartments. Room number 1 served as the specific setting for a series of events that would eventually draw the attention of international scientists and high-ranking politicians. The building's history is defined by a legacy of shamanic practice and an unsolved disappearance, leaving a reputation that remains tied to the property more than a century after its construction. During the mid-20th century, a woman named Barbara Guerrero, known as Pachita, operated a healing practice out of room number 1. Pachita claimed to enter a trance state to become the direct spiritual vessel for Cuauhtémoc, the final Aztec emperor. In this state, observers noted a change in her physical strength and the tone of her voice. Patients would lie on a table in near-total darkness, while Pachita performed surgeries using only a rusty old hunting knife. She used no anesthesia and no modern medical tools. She allegedly reached into open incisions with her bare hands, claiming to remove diseased tissue and replace it with healthy organs. When she pressed her hands over the wound, the skin would reportedly seal instantly, leaving only a faint red scar. Her clientele was not limited to the local community. She was visited by international scientists, celebrities, and several high-ranking Mexican politicians who sought out her procedures in secret. These surgeries directly contradicted the established principles of modern medicine, leading members of the scientific community to attempt a formal documentation of her work. Dr. Jacobo Grinberg, a neurophysiologist and professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, began a multi-year investigation into Pachita's practices. Grinberg spent many years inside La Casa de las Brujas, observing dozens of these procedures up close, in the dark, to record his findings for his academic research. This research led to his synergic theory. He posited Pachita used conscious brain activity to interact with the fundamental structure of space-time, manipulating physical matter directly. This explained how she could materialize solid objects and repair tissue without standard medical equipment. However, in 1994, Dr. Grinberg vanished. His disappearance remains unsolved, with no traces of his whereabouts found in the decades since. The loss of the lead scientist investigating room number 1 left his research unfinished, fueling decades of speculation regarding the nature of the work he was conducting inside the building. Pachita died in 1979, and while the building has been converted into residential apartments, residents continue to report physical phenomena tied to her former suite. Tenants near room number 1 describe feelings of physical heaviness, frequent electronic malfunctions, and instances where domestic pets refuse to enter specific areas of the apartment. Between the hours of 2 and 4 a.m., residents have reported the sound of guttural chanting in Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, rising through the building's ventilation shafts. These auditory reports are often accompanied by a metallic scent of blood and the smell of burning copal incense seeping from the vents. Late-night pedestrians passing Plaza Rio de Janeiro have reported seeing the silhouette of an elderly woman in the dormer windows or a figure pacing the interior corridors of the building. Today, La Casa de Las Brujas stands as a location where Gothic architecture, ancient shamanic ritual, and an unsolved scientific mystery coexist in the center of Colonia, Roma. If you were living there and heard chanting in your vents at 3 a.m., what would you do? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this look into one of Mexico City's most mysterious landmarks, like and subscribe for more deep dives. Imagine walking through a dimly lit 16th century Mexican colonial cloister, but instead of flickering candlelight, the heavy air is pierced by glowing avant-garde neon installations. This is the Laboratorio Arte Alameda, a contemporary digital media gallery in downtown Mexico City. Artists from around the world project massive digital tapestries direct onto these ancient stone walls. But the people who know this building best, the night staff and the museum guards, refuse to patrol these corridors alone. They routinely report terrifying encounters with things that shouldn't be there. Before we find out exactly what they're seeing in the dark, take a second to hit the subscribe button down below. Let me know in the comments, would you ever spend the night in a haunted museum? The source of their dread isn't the art. It's buried beneath the cracked stone floors. This exact location was once the official execution ground of the Spanish Inquisition. The flashing neon lights and modern projectors are covering up a terrifying truth. To understand what haunts this gallery today, we have to dig into the centuries of physical trauma locked directly inside its foundation. Look at the sprawling green lawns of modern-day Alameda Central Park. Back in the late 16th century, Spanish colonial authorities established their official burning site, known as El Quemadero, right on the western edge of this boundary. In 1591, the Spanish crown granted a plot of land directly abutting this execution square to the Franciscan Order of the Diaguinos. They used it to build the ex-convento de San Diego. For over 150 years, the friars lived a surreal, horrific existence. They conducted daily prayers and quiet liturgy inside the cloister walls, while just outside their windows, hundreds of people convicted of heresy and rebellion were tied to wooden stakes and burned alive. By the 1770s, the city expanded Alameda Park and dismantled the execution square, leaving vacant, blood-soaked land next to the monastery. Seeing an opportunity, the monks pushed their courtyards outward, building massive vaults directly over the ash-filled soil of the pyres. By swallowing the execution grounds whole, the church literally built its new walls out of the ashes of the Inquisition. The physical horrors of El Quemadero became the structural foundation of the monastery itself. Following the Mexican War of Independence and the reform laws of the 1850s, the government confiscated the entire complex from the Catholic Church. The sacred spaces were immediately repurposed for war. During the chaotic conflicts of the 19th century, the monastery served as military barracks. Soldiers slept in the cloisters, and horses were stabled directly inside the former chapels. Eventually, the building fell into the hands of industry. The remaining gold leaf altars and colonial frescoes we scraped away to make room for massive printing presses, turning the once quiet nave into a deafening, grease-stained warehouse. The government finally intervened in 1964, restoring the battered complex to house a colonial art museum, before ultimately transitioning it into the Laboratorio Arte Alameda in the year 2000. From a holy sanctuary to a public execution site, to military cavalry barracks, to a deafening industrial factory, 2 centuries of constant physical destruction and aggressive industrial repurposing acted like a pressure cooker, compounding all that brutal energy into the stone. Which brings us back to the artists and museum guards of today. The centuries of violence embedded in the building's fabric have begun to bleed through into the modern gallery in 3 very specific ways. First, night patrols routinely encounter apparitions of Franciscan friars pacing the upper arcades. Witnesses report watching figures in traditional brown robes glide silently across the floors, sometimes passing straight through heavily reinforced, locked gallery doors. Second, there is the audio. Staff setting up lighting rigs long after closing hours frequently hear disembodied Gregorian chants bouncing off the high vaulted ceilings, mixed with urgent, hushed murmurs spoken in archaic 17th century Spanish. Finally, there are intense physical reactions. Visitors often experience sudden bouts of extreme claustrophobia and nausea. The climate-controlled rooms will suffer sudden, massive temperature plunges, chilling the air so deeply that guests can actually see their own breath. What makes these physical anomalies so terrifying is exactly where they happen. Museum officials have tracked these extreme temperature drops directly to the specific lower gallery spaces, constructed right over the original ash-filled soil of the Inquisition's execution ground. Today, the Laboratorio Arte Alameda stands as a bizarre collision of eras. Inside, artists push the absolute boundaries of digital expression, but right beneath their feet, the ground remains tightly anchored to the screams of the Inquisition, making the entire building a quiet monument to Mexico City's darkest colonial chapters. In 16th century Mexico City, colonial authorities enforced a strict 11 o'clock curfew. After dark, the capital was abandoned to the freezing, heavy mist that rolled over its narrow cobblestone streets. Night watchmen on patrol documented a specific recurring terror, a spectral female figure wrapped in a tattered white burial shroud, gliding silently along the banks of the Acequia Real Canal. Piercing the silence of the iron-grated avenues, her wails of "Ay, mis hijos," "Oh, my children," became the defining sound of the colonial night. These sightings effectively paralyzed the capital after sunset. The city's canal networks, which served as the primary arteries for trade, became places the population avoided at all costs. As the population moved south, these fears migrated with them, toward the stone bridges and ancient waterways of Chimalistac. To protect themselves from a phantom whose gaze was said to induce madness, locals erected a small stone votive chapel. Travelers stopped here to light candles, hoping for safe passage through the nocturnal fog. This figure is catalogued in the 16th century trial files of the Spanish Inquisition. These archives contain a legal record of a real woman whose life was documented by the colonial courts. Before we examine the specific crimes recorded in these documents, subscribe to the channel and let me know about a local urban legend from your area in the comments. Examining these records reveals a documented historical foundation for the myth, buried directly beneath the surface of the ghost story. Her name was Luisa de Olvera. In the mid-1500s, Luisa lived as a mestiza woman of mixed Spanish and indigenous heritage along the central canal networks of the city. She entered into a long-term affair with Don Muñoz Montes de Oca, a wealthy Spanish nobleman. Together, they had 3 children outside of marriage. Don Muñoz eventually abandoned Luisa and his children to marry a high-society Spanish noblewoman intended to preserve his social rank and his estate. The abandonment drove Luisa into a state of despair. She took her 3 children to the edge of the Acequia Real, the city's main drainage canal, and drowned them in the cold water. This single act of infanticide shattered the social boundaries of the colonial city and set her on a path toward the Inquisition. Spanish colonial authorities arrested Luisa as she wandered the canal banks screaming in remorse. The Holy Office of the Inquisition took charge of her case. They convicted her of both the murders and heresy, preserving the judgment in these official ink-scripted records. Luisa was sentenced to be burned alive at the stake. The execution was carried out in public, directly outside her own residence. This execution permanently renamed the street to Calle de la Quemada, the street of the burned woman. These red colonial buildings stand on the site today. Rather than erasing her memory, The Inquisition's sentence created the conditions for the legend to take root across Latin America. As the Spanish built the modern city, they systematically filled in the ancient Aztec canal networks, replacing the water with a grid of paved roads. As these central waterways disappeared, sightings of the ghost moved southward toward Chimalastac, following the few remaining open water lines. Modern Mexico City exists on top of these filled-in canals, with the historical sites of the legend now entombed beneath the pavement. This geographic displacement leaves the phantoms searching for rivers that no longer exist, effectively trapped in the city's modern architecture. Historians link Luisa's specific tragedy to the figure of La Malinche, the indigenous woman who aided Hernán Cortés. Both women are defined by their relationships with Spanish men and the subsequent loss of their children's future. This connection allows the weeping woman to function as a symbol for a conquered nation, reflecting the grief of a population mourning its lost heritage and its erased indigenous past. To see more deep dives into the history behind urban legends, subscribe and join us for the next video. La Llorona remains a fixture of the city's geography, not just a ghost on a colonial street, but the grieving memory of Mexico City itself.